Anguishedly, the grandsire of a kid who is 12 years old watches in the hopes of reuniting with his granddaughter after she and her grandson went missing while on safari. But 10 years later, her grandson shows up at her door and says something so shocking, something she never expected. Evelyn Carter's heart skipped a beat as she opened the front door to her peaceful suburban neighborhood, bathed in a low sun. On the threshold stood a young man who looked older than his years due to his unkempt appearance and worn face. Fearing he would demand money or attempt to break in, she went to slam the door on him. She felt her breath catch in her mouth as she suddenly recognized the tiny birthmark on his palm. "Daniel," she murmured. Slowly nodding was Daniel Becker, the youngster whose mother had abducted while on a safari in Africa a decade ago. "It's me, Grandma." In a state of disbelief, Evelyn leaned back against the wall. From the moment she heard her daughter and grandson were missing, she devoted her life to locating them. However, she never found a single clue. She had sunk all of her life savings into exploring the communities close to the spot where they went missing, hoping to find some clues. Strangely, she had never done so before. It seemed as though they had disappeared completely. Then why had Daniel shown up at her door? Not to mention, where was his mom? Evelyn continued to be astounded as she escorted the young man inside. There were many similarities between the young man standing before her and the youngster who had slept over or played video games on the floor of her living room, or sat on the couch with popcorn and hot chocolate. Still, he was unique in every way. Despite being 22 years old, Daniel gave off an impression that belied his actual age. Evelyn could almost make out a few gray hairs and deep wrinkles on his face. Fearing that he would no longer identify as her grandson prevented her from embracing him, despite her strong desire to do so. Or maybe this would all be a dream after she broke the bind. Without uttering a word, the two stood awkwardly in the kitchen. Evelyn had fantasized about this moment for a long time, but she never thought it would play out this way. She had a lot of questions, but Daniel seemed visibly shaken by whatever had transpired over the past decade, and she had no idea how vulnerable he might be. However, she couldn't help but give in. She embraced the boy tightly. Daniel was her height when they last met. She was dwarfed by him now. She could feel his slender frame through his many garments. His body trembled with sobs as he sunk into her embrace, and she felt them. After what seemed like an eternity, Daniel eventually separated himself from his grandma. The young man's face was flushed and spotted, and his tears had soaked her shoulder. Never before had Evelyn wished she could alleviate someone's suffering to the extent that she did at that very time. Daniel took a long breath. "I must confide in you all," he started, his voice clear yet unwavering. "But first, you have to promise me that once I do, you'll believe me." Nodding, Evelyn held her grandson's face in her hands. "Sure, I'll believe you, my darling," she responded, wiping away her own tears. Whatever he had to say, she could tell it would be difficult for him to speak about, and for her to hear as well. Gathering the young man into the living room, she brewed a pot of coffee and leaned back in her armchair to listen. The idea that her grandson would unexpectedly appear and say this had never occurred to Evelyn. On the very first day of their trip, Daniel got right to work. Along with his mother, Claire, he had been on an expedition to a secluded area of the Serengeti. Claire raised her children alone. She devoted her life to providing Daniel with the greatest experiences, going above and beyond their modest suburban home after his father died in a work accident when he was just 2 years old. Even at the little age of 12, he had visited more nations than some individuals see in a lifetime. For Claire, her son would acquire more than just facts in a classroom. She thought that traveling would expose him to diverse cultures, cuisines, and languages. Daniel would have been content to travel anywhere on the globe, but he had been captivated by a documentary on safaris in Africa a few years ago. Although he was never one to ask his mom for anything, he felt compelled to ask after the show concluded whether they could go on a safari sometime. After they finally boarded the cruise, he regretted making that request every single second. Daniel had no idea the trip would begin on such a spectacular note. They were scheduled to spend 4 nights at a safari lodge, during which time they would embark on daily excursions with a small group and a guide to visit different sections of the national park. The young boy's wildest dreams had finally come true. Then it became a living nightmare. Upon reaching the resort, Daniel and Claire took a moment to themselves on the veranda to capture the setting sun in a photo. Photographing the two of them had always been Claire's favorite pastime. They were both unaware that it would be the final occasion of its kind. On the third day, Daniel eagerly awoke to a fiery sunrise, filled with anticipation for what lay ahead. Curious about the day's happenings, he and Claire got dressed. The idea that they could be in danger never occurred to them. It was safe in the park. A lot of expertise went into the rangers' work. Plus, they thought there would be more security in numbers. However, their mistake was exposed only a short time later. Their guide had pulled up next to a watering hole and spoke about how great it was for seeing animals. Leaning over the open-top Jeep for a closer view, Daniel had been captivated until Claire abruptly grasped his wrist. Something was amiss. All of a sudden, the creatures took flight, and then, almost immediately, most of them had disappeared. The countryside fell into a haunting stillness. This is when Daniel stopped telling his story. As he grasped his coffee cup, his grandmother saw his shaking hands and realized she had to be ready for anything. This scene had been rehearsed in Daniel's thoughts for a decade. He had experienced every conceivable feeling. However, he never imagined he would be the one to tell his grandma this tale. After the Jeep came to a halt, he was at a loss for words to express what had happened. He went on, pausing to catch his breath. The safari guide's terrified expression alerted everyone that the vehicle wasn't working after he tried to restart it. The animals had no connection to the group's arrival since they were accustomed to Jeeps driving through. Things descended into anarchy as soon as the Jeep began moving. Shots rang out. From behind the trees and bushes, masked men in military fatigues poured out to ambush the party. Screaming and running for shelter, the safari goers hid. In any case, Claire went with her gut. Then she snatched Daniel and bolted. Despite the lack of shelter afforded by the dense brush, she continued forth, propelled by adrenaline, while dragging her son behind her. Tears were falling from the small boy's eyes as he heard shouts and gunfire coming from all directions. Their destination remained a mystery to his mother. She would never be able to outrun the gang. However, she persisted, resolute in her mission to safeguard them. She slowed down as she descended, due to exhaustion and an inflated sense of self-confidence. The only sounds were those of bird song and the gentle rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Claire paused to collect herself. Nevertheless, Daniel insisted that she go. Out of nowhere, a bullet flew right by them. Claire was taken aback. A scream escaped Daniel's lips. He pleaded with his mom to keep going, but he could see that her face was turning pale. She continued to stutter and eventually collapsed on the floor. It was futile for Daniel to try and drag her along. His strength was inadequate. She pushed him forward with all her remaining power. "Go on," she exclaimed with a gasp. Then he did as instructed. He backed away cautiously at first, his vision obscured by tears, as he was overcome with fear. He looked back several times and saw his mother's silhouette on the grass, and he wanted to lay down beside her with all his being. He felt guilty about leaving her every moment of the next decade. He continued to hold himself responsible for everything, even after learning the truth about what had happened to her. It was an overwhelming sense of remorse that he felt he would never overcome. He ran till his legs gave out, then collapsed onto the grass, sick with exhaustion and nausea after hearing voices. Crying and struggling to breathe, he laid face down. A rough hand grabbed him up, and he couldn't tell how much time had gone by. One of the men in masks, was it? Out of the underbrush, the man slung him like a sack and dragged him away. They pushed Daniel into the back of a truck as he readied himself for death. Looking up, he recognized a couple more faces from the trip. He could not find his mother. Daniel was held captive within a terrorist compound for 10 years after that. Men tried to mold him into one of their own and controlled his every move. Daniel kept trying to find a way out, even though they had him labor and learn their methods. The truth about Claire being shot in the ambush eventually came to light for him. She had sacrificed herself to save him. A part of him knew it, but hearing it spoken aloud broke him. Until then, he had clung to the dream that he would reunite with her in the future. That optimism had propelled him forward. However, he felt lifeless after realizing she had genuinely departed. He was indifferent to his own fate for quite some time. He longed for death, any means to flee from the misery that consumed him. Then, while sleeping one night, he saw a vision of his mom. At first, he didn't give them much thought because they happened frequently. However, I sensed a change. When he thought about how much time had passed since his mother had sacrificed herself so he may live, he felt terrible about how careless he had been. That understanding was so heavy, it broke him. Ending things in this way was unacceptable to him. A way out had to be found by him. A soldier inside the camp, disheartened by the violence of his boss, gradually came to trust him. This soldier stood out from the rest. This man would sometimes sneak Daniel additional food and tell him stories about his life, in contrast to the majority of the men who spoke to Daniel primarily to threaten or issue commands. The soldier had joined the squad with preconceived notions about its purpose. However, a new leader was installed shortly thereafter, and he despised the group's transformation. Still, he was ensnared. He couldn't leave after his family's safety had been jeopardized. A subtle friendship developed between Daniel and the soldier as they both grew older. He felt he had no human connection with anyone else there save the man. Even though Daniel had his doubts about this man, he sensed that he was unique. A paternal figure emerged in his eyes. In due time, Daniel mustered the nerve to beg for his assistance. He informed him that he needed to get out of there when no one else was listening. The soldier first ignored me. The safety of his loved ones and himself was too important to him to risk. A few weeks down the road, though, he reconsidered. Daniel started making plans to get away with the help of the soldier. Both his freedom and the soldier's innocence depended on it being flawless. For weeks, they would sneak away to talk about their plans, and when they finally felt the time was perfect, they would act on it. Under the cover of night, Daniel slipped away one night. His heart was racing as he cautiously made his way through perilous terrain, fully aware that he may be apprehended at any second. He simply knew he had to keep going in the hopes of meeting someone who could lend him a hand. He had no notion where else to go. His mother crossed his mind as he sprinted. Regarding the soldier who had jeopardized his life to aid him, his heart ached for the man's protection, the fact that their strategy had been astute enough to safeguard him. He had finally returned home after a lengthy journey that had taken several weeks. He had hoped that the house he recalled still belonged to his grandma. As Evelyn listened, tears fell down her cheeks. Both her daughter's death and her grandson's unfathomable pain broke her heart. Still, Daniel had made it. Finally, he was back. As positive as she could be when they initially disappeared, Evelyn maintained her optimism. She thought every phone call would have wonderful news. Some new clue would be found on every journey, she thought to herself. She was certain that every appeal would lead to answers in the end. Her optimism, however, started to wane as the years went by with no updates, clues, or prospects. There was a part of her that couldn't bring herself to say it out loud, but she was beginning to accept the reality that her daughter and grandchild had just vanished without a trace. After all this time, her grandson was finally back with her, and the truth was with him. The feeling was one of mixed emotions. She had suffered the loss of her daughter, and the impact on Daniel from this ordeal was uncertain. Forcibly subjected to atrocities no child should ever face, he had been abducted, seen his mother's death, and spent 10 years with a violent gang. They had to put a stop to the gang. The many times Evelyn had journeyed to other towns and her frantic quest for information flashed through her mind. Somebody must have known. Whether it was out of allegiance or fear, she would never know, but someone had to have covered for the gang. What she did know, though, was that she would not stand by while another family or child went through this. Daniel hesitated before deciding to contact the police. His words to Evelyn were, "We'll never be safe if we do that." All he wanted was to go on, just to put the past decade out of one's mind. Not even Evelyn pushed him. It would have been useless, she realized. But that night, upon lying in the identical bed he had slept in throughout his childhood visits to his grandmother, the burden of all that he had lost finally settled on his heart. Even though he wanted justice for his mother, it wasn't the only thing on his mind. He was a little boy when they abducted him. By the time he was an adult, he had already escaped. He had lost a significant portion of his life expectancy. Because of that group, he had been transformed for all time. He was also aware that he was far from alone. Just how many more kids had they abducted? Just think of all the lives they had damaged. Stopping them was within his power. The following day, he informed Evelyn that he intended to contact the authorities. That was his only choice. At the station, he provided his statement, in which he described everything he had heard and seen, including the location of their facility and the identities of those involved. The authorities were as taken aback by his arrival as Evelyn had been. Surprisingly, though, they gave him significant consideration. They were quick to respond. As they pledged to keep Daniel and Evelyn safe during the investigation, they set out on a mission to bring the gang to justice. The militant group was found and disbanded after weeks of meticulous planning with the help of Daniel's knowledge. This terrible catastrophe will never again befall an innocent person. Daniel experienced a sense of relief that he hadn't felt in a decade. Nothing he did could return his mother to him. However, they had prevented a recurrence of such an incident. A long path lay ahead, he knew. But now, finally, he had an opportunity to build his own life accordingly. The fact that Claire's body was never found was not surprising considering how much time had gone by. It was an unfortunate truth, but at least the family will finally have some peace of mind. In the end, though, Evelyn was certain that she would accept it. Returning to her was her grandson. Although she had hoped for a different outcome, she was relieved to have answers now. After planning a funeral service for Claire, she laid a memorial stone in the spot where a grave should have been. It provided a place where they could go to honor her memory, a final resting spot. Even after the congregation had departed, Daniel stayed by the memorial. He laid a floral arrangement on the table and then shut his eyes. "I managed to escape, Mom," he whispered. "You are the reason." He knew the past would follow him wherever he went. A second opportunity had been presented to him, and he could finally enjoy the life that his mother had battled for.